We've had a sneak preview in Liang Che's comments about the U.S. underwriting many of the horrible things we've been talking about emanating from communist China at the moment. I'm very pleased to have my colleague and friend Roger Robinson, former Senior Director for International Economic Affairs at the Reagan National Security Council, one of the men who helped President Reagan translate the 1970s version of the Committee on the Present Danger into a strategy for taking down the USSR. And we're pleased to have him come back to talk a little bit more about a case study of how American investors are unwittingly enabling the sort of police state apparatus that Lan Chao also talked about, and talked to us about Hick Vision. Roger Robinson. He is these days, among other things, chairing the Prague Security Studies Institute, and I believe it's in that capacity that you're here.
I am. And what's our timetable?
About 15 minutes.
Excellent. Try to observe it for once. Well, it's, as always, a privilege to have a chance to speak to you today. As Frank knows, and the committee has rather fulsomely explored this rather new topic of the Chinese corporate presence in the U.S. capital markets. And to the surprise of many, we're not talking about small change. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of oftentimes high risk, what folks would, I think, immediately conclude are Chinese bad actors from the perspective of national security and human rights abuses that have successfully entered our markets, and in so doing, the portfolios of average Americans, including those in the room. Now, it's not just a few Americans. I don't know how many Americans total are in the markets, maybe 180, 200 million if I took a rough guess. So we're talking about the bulk of the population of the United States. And as you may also guess, not having heard much about this subject, if anything, in the past, it should tell you that there's been no security-minded or human rights-minded screening mechanism ever put up over the capital markets of the United States, despite the fact that our markets are roughly the size of the rest of the world's combined. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if China has $1 trillion in exposure in our markets. It's a very difficult subject to research. We've been at it for a couple of years, and I feel that even now we're just at the biopsy stage of trying to understand this pathology. Because make no mistake, these are not necessarily benign entities. They are ones that we would be concerned about. For example, we talked about Hick Vision. Obviously, they are one of the world's, if not the world's, leading provider of surveillance cameras that are littering the tops of the walls of the concentration camps, housing 1, 2, or more million Uyghurs. This is something I'd like to come back to because we are finally getting action in that portfolio, having highlighted the fact that Americans are unwittingly aiding and abetting the concentration camp business, which is something that I think we'd all be loath to see as using our hard-earned investment dollars, whether our retirement systems or one of other many funds, from index funds to exchange-traded funds, mutual funds. It's a long list. And it's faceless fund managers that we all, myself included, turn our funds over and hope that they'll do the right thing. Well, they may be going for return, but they're not going for values, and they're not going for moral compass. That's what I'll assure you of today. Illustrations. China Unicom. sounds benign enough, listed on the New York Stock Exchange, no less. A serial PLA contractor. They provide the telecom services to the Chinese military in the South China Sea, including its signal intelligence facilities. They provide North Korea with its only internet service. That should tell you something. They are the entity that provided the wherewithal for the PLA's most aggressive cyber attack unit, APT-1, to hack into hundreds of American companies and steal our competitive information so that their state-owned enterprises of China would be able to be even more assured than they already are of taking these contracts. So that is a small profile of MSCI, and worse still, they're in the MSCI Emerging Market Index. I was meant Hike Vision now we're talking about. Besides being on the New York Stock Exchange, it's also in the MSCI Emerging Market Index. That index is tracked by $16 trillion of funds under management. So when a Chinese company is added to an index fund, automatically that $16 trillion buys that stock. Now, think of the windfall for China. And think of the fact that that company goes into every otherwise healthy cell of the American body politic. That's what you call going viral. Instantly. And they're not alone in the MSCI. If you look at other entities that have found this promised land for China, this very efficient way of entering the portfolios of the American people in one shot, look at other participants. AVIC Aircraft. That sounds innocent enough. What do? Well, they produce a range of fighter aircraft and unmanned aerial vehicles. They're responsible for China's anti-ship missiles deployed in the South China Sea. They've been sanctioned several times, but you're not going to read about that in the prospectus that they're submitting to the SEC, supposedly recording material risks so that all of us are properly informed before we make an investment decision. You don't see these types of profiles appear there, despite, again, the materiality of that risk to share value and corporate reputation. I mean, even if we put moral compass and our national security concerns aside, we still have the fact that these are fundamental market violations where all of us need to disclose our risks properly, and yet the Chinese get a free pass in not doing so. More recently, AVIC has provided Iran's new ground-based anti-ship cruise missiles, which may be readied as we speak to use against American naval forces in the Sixth Fleet and beyond. Moving on, China's shipbuilding. They just build commercial ships, right? Well, think again. Guided missile destroyers. They build nuclear ballistic missile submarines. They're the ones that are targeting our cities. They're the ones that are targeting your families. And they're the ones that are benefiting from your investment dollars, as in the people in this room, much less our fellow Americans. Has this issue ever seen the light of day? Do you recall anybody talking about this on Capitol Hill, in the executive branch, in the media, in a cocktail party? You'd think that somebody would have said something by now, but they didn't, did they? Now, I'm talking about empirical facts here. I'm not talking about my opinion versus yours on something like missile defense. So this should tell you something else. It tells you that the very fact that we don't know about this and that we're focused almost single-mindedly on U.S.-China trade, as important as it is, because this is where they live and die. This is the money. This was the money with the Soviet Union. That's what we went after. We went after their hard currency cash flow. We went after their escape valves in Western governments and banks providing those credits. They'd be up today if Ronald Reagan had not put clamps on every one of the life support tubes that we were providing. And guess what? Here we go again. Now, Hikvision, I'll conclude by saying, it could be a success story. This issue has been out there for a while. The human rights community, our friends at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and others, have been alert to this for a long time, that they were aiding and abetting these concentration camps and the fate of this massive number of people that you can see from space. Well, but it's hard to give it expression. It's hard to get critical mass attention, much less action. Well, we've made a breakthrough there, which is we're now able to look at publicly traded Chinese companies with a presence in our capital markets who are providing the wherewithal for that facial recognition technology, for those very surveillance cameras that keep them tucked away behind razor wire. Now, this is out there. And Victims of Communism and others have made it so. Now we're hearing that Hikvision may be being readied for the entity list of the Department of Commerce, where you need a license to supply any components. I mean, this could be a major problem for Hikvision, to say the least. You see what's happened to Huawei. You saw what happened to ZTE before that. And I think, with any luck, Hikvision is going to hit the wall on that entity list, remembering that their parent company has already been put on the entity list because they're, big surprise, a national security violator. Can we have more Hikvisions? Can we bring recognition to this issue once and for all? And the answer is yes, we can. We have the power to do this. This is our money. We have a right to hold Wall Street accountable. We have a duty to do so. And finally, we can give expressions to our most coveted values, both national security and human rights. Thank you very much.
Roger, I just want to take the liberty to ask you to specifically address one question that you've talked about more elsewhere than I think you did here. And that is the disparity between the way these companies from China are being treated by our Securities and Exchange Commission relative to how they treat our own companies. Would you just talk about that as another place where we need to make changes?
Sure. This gets down to disclosure and accountability. And that's why those remedies can serve us so well in this case. Namely, in the U.S. or a West European country, or any of those of our allies, face a rigorous test when they come to the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, even to a lesser extent, our over-the-counter market. That the disclosure is fundamental, as is risk management. You're supposed to record any material risk to share value and corporate reputation. And if you don't, it's called by the SEC a material omission. which is legally actionable. So it's against the law. I mean, let's be clear, this is not a small thing. And yet, whereas we will go after an American company for a material omission, but China doesn't write any of this down. They don't tell you that they're in the South China Sea. They don't tell you that they're underwriting North Korean nuclear and missile capabilities. They don't tell you that they've been sanctioned before. They don't tell you that their employees have been arrested for espionage. Where's that in the risk section? And isn't that material to my decision as to whether or not to buy the stock? They can be sanctioned. I mean, even if you put our values aside, what about share value? What's going to happen to their corporate reputation when they show up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or something of that kind? So this is actually, ironically, evening the playing field. This is preferential treatment. Now, imagine the irony. I mean, how sickening an affair this really is.
One more question from the audience. Anybody?
Yes.
That's good.
Or are you up to
Right here, Peter.
Roger, what's preventing the SEC from doing its job?
Well, in part, the SEC has never been confronted with the notion that should be obvious to all of us and every American, which is the materiality of national security abuses in your background or in your network of subsidiaries, not to mention human rights abuses like are taking place in Tibet and vis-a-vis the Uyghurs. So these are not acknowledged to be material risk categories. How convenient. You know, how lovely for Beijing that we just kind of give that one a miss, don't we? We're interested in corruption and we're interested in a number of other things, but these two categories don't seem to make the cut. And that's what we're able to change, and that's where we should be headed.